and welcome to Macro Matters. My name's Stephanie Kelly, and together with my co-host Paul Diggle, we'll be guiding you through the complex world of politics, economics, and markets. Now, we talk a lot on this podcast about the COVID pandemic and the many ways that it has impacted all of our lives, both professionally and of course, personally. And in the economic sphere, well, we thought forecasting was tough before COVID, and boy, were we in for a surprise with this pandemic.
You'll notice that we said that the pandemic still provides considerable downside risks to the economy, and that's one of the reasons why is the slowness of the rollout. Another reason why is just the arrival of these new virus strains. We don't know how to model that. You know, we can have a base case, but we realize no one knows how this new vaccine will roll out, how successful it will be, how high we'll be able to drive vaccination, and those sorts of things. So we have a base case, but we always look at the range of possibilities. In this case, we particularly look at the downside risks.
So that was Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell, and he was highlighting just how COVID has added yet another layer of complexity to forecasting future growth and returns for economists, for policymakers, and for investors. But today we wanted to talk about what that actually means in practice. How do we think about how a vaccine rollout legitimately affects activity and ultimately the trajectory for short and long-term growth? I'm delighted to be joined by two very familiar voices to this podcast. My co-host Paul Diggle is here, and Chief Economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments, Jeremy Lawson, is also joining us. Thanks both so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.
So let's maybe kick it off. And Paul, I might go to you first just to ask how you kind of think about forecasting in a global pandemic at a very high level. What is the order of which you think about things?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely right to say it was always hard, but it's now got even harder. And in particular, I think we, as economists, no longer do we just have to think about forecasting economic activity and inflation and monetary and fiscal policy, but there are basically these preceding steps that we now need to try and incorporate. And I think the first step is the course of the virus, case numbers, deaths, what it does to the health system, and more recently, the vaccine rollout. Do we get vaccines? How effective are they? Can we distribute them? Do people take them? So that's sort of, I think, the first component along this sort of forecasting process. The next and also new stage is the course of lockdowns, this enforced cessation of economic activity. And in part, that what you expect to happen with lockdowns and lockdown stringency is a product of the course of the virus, so stage one, and the course of vaccine rollout. But there's also lots of other things that drive the stringency of lockdowns, things like political preferences and choices, obedience to the lockdown. So there's a lot of sort of subcomponents that I'm sure we'll get into of how you forecast the lockdown itself. And there are also, it's worth mentioning, actual measures out there that try and quantify on an index of 0 to 100 the stringency of a lockdown. And then the final stage is, how do we translate that all into economic activity? And again, that is a difficult process. It's probably not stationary the way that the course of the virus and the course of lockdowns affect economic activity, but clearly there must be some link. And that's, I think, how we've sort of tried to split this forecasting process. And I think the final thing to say is that although our original area of expertise clearly lies in stage 3, forecasting the macroeconomy, and we're not epidemiologists, but is the phrase you'll always hear at the moment, but we do have to give our best shot at explaining our expectations for the course of the virus, the course of the vaccine rollout, and lockdown stringency itself. If we can't form views on those things, there's no way we could do stage 3, which we're actually trying to do, which is forecasting the course of the macroeconomy.
I think that's a really good point, Paul, about kind of saying we recognize our limitations. I think sometimes economists get a bit of grief for trying to get involved in too many areas, but it clearly is the case that having a view on growth means having a view on the virus and vaccines and what that means for lockdown. So maybe let's get a better sense, Jeremy, if I can bring you in on this actually, around that first step, kind of looking at vaccine rollout or looking at the outlook for inoculations in different countries. And I know we've kind of built this sort of a process to try and do it in a more transparent way than just kind of guessing. Could you give us a sense of how that process works?
Yeah, so taking on board that very reasonable point, which as economists, we're not epidemiologists, so we can't accurately forecast the short-term dynamics of the virus itself. But what we can try and do is build a picture of what the most likely course, given the available information, of what, say, a vaccine rollout process might look like, building it from each of the really important sort of blocks in that process. So what we noticed early on in the pandemic is that there was a tendency to almost rush straight from, will there be a vaccine that is efficacious or not, then all the way to the end point of, okay, so what does this mean for the number of people who might be inoculated at a given point? But there are so many important steps and judgments that have to be made along that journey, right? So we need to take on board, initially it was, would we get efficacious vaccines or not? But that we've crossed that threshold, so that's great. But different vaccines have different degrees of efficacy in different circumstances, and different vaccines are available in different ways for key economies, right? So we have to take that variation into account when we're building up effectively a national effective inoculation into our numbers. We have to look at the course of manufacturing of different vaccines, and we've seen very recently how disruptions in parts of the supply chain or getting ready to prepare for a larger increase in production in the future can lead to supply disruptions that slow the pace of rollout when that supply is binding in the near term. We've seen that with the Pfizer vaccine recently, but we have to have a clearly articulated view of what we think that manufacturing capacity looks like along different waymarks. We then have to take into account, what you might sort of refer to as the messiness of institutional capacity to get a vaccine to the desired populations, right? Something we observe, and it shouldn't be surprising because there are unintended consequences of all policies, right? So no implementation of a policy is perfect, right? But different health systems, different public health systems, different sort of governments in the way that they're organized and prepared to fund things, they have different abilities to deliver vaccines according to particular schedules to organize themselves. Then once you have that type of information, well, we also then have to think about it from the demand side. So different individuals have a different amount of receptiveness to taking a vaccine. There is survey information that we can draw on that gives us a sense of what those attitudes are like, but those attitudes themselves are not constant over time. So not only do we need to sort of try and understand a snapshot in time about willingness to take a vaccine of particular groups in particular countries, but try and factor in how that might change. And so what you could almost sort of think about every step along the way as being probabilistic, right? So you have a view, for example, about the proportion of people in a given country that are going to be willing to take a vaccine. And then when the demand becomes sort of binding on that progress, then you multiply the two. And so effectively it sort of takes, you end up with you might start with a very high degree of manufacturing capacity, but the number of effective inoculations drops through the successive stages as you extend your horizon. Once you take into account ability to deliver, once you take into account take up, once you take into account efficacy. And so what we try and do, though, is recognize that in each of these different areas, there are bodies of expertise that we can draw on. Right? This is very important. Right? It's not that we are then sort of trying to make up our own models of take-up rates or efficacy. We're taking the existing body of information, drawing it together, applying it to the country that is, that it is meant for, and then we build that up into an aggregate view. But it also allows us to very simply make changes when core components alter. So, for example, in the last 2 months, we've observed that once it became clear that efficacious vaccines were available and governments start to promote their use, then across a wide range of countries, willingness, at least surveyed willingness to take a vaccine, has increased. But that becomes a variable that we can alter in our framework so that we can then make appropriate adjustments to our terminal forecast for the proportion of the population that has been effectively inoculated at a given point. So that hopefully just gives an overview of something that it's complex, but we think it just provides a better sort of starting point, so that when we go into the next stage, which is arguably even more important, which is what does that future look like for restrictions on activity, that we're grounding it in a reasonable expectation for what proportion of the population are protected from the virus in different ways.
That's great. I think that's as you say, a useful way just to understand how we're thinking about it. I think the crucial thing there is transparency and just having that framework that you are accountable to and kind of go back to. Paul, maybe then just to move on to steps 2 and 3, how do you take that view that, number of effective inoculations, which we are going to go into what we actually think the effective inoculations for this year look like. But for now, once you've got that first step, what happens in step 2 and what happens in step 3? You kind of gave us a preview at the beginning, but maybe just to give a little bit more detail about what the nuts and bolts looks like, turning a vaccine forecast into a view on stringency into an economic forecast.
Yeah, absolutely. So on stringency, the first thing to say is that it can be measured, and there are measures out there, and the way that they're built is from the subcomponents of stringency or of lockdown. So these might be things like, are schools closed or not? Is hospitality closed or not? And within that, is it operating via takeaway only? So there are different levels. Is international travel banned, subject to bans from high-risk areas, requiring quarantine, requiring a test before you travel, or are there no limitations at all? Is internal travel restricted? Are the size of gatherings limited, and to what size? So all these things go into essentially a lockdown stringency index, which we as economists can measure and compare across countries. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, going from stage 1, vaccines and the broader state of the pandemic, to stringency is not mechanical. It partly depends on our expectations for vaccination and effective coverage of the population, but it depends on a lot of other things as well. Virus incidents and the effect of previous lockdowns and previous stringency in containing the virus. Weather has some impact, it seems, on virus incidents as well. Political preferences, so the desire to sustain a certain level of lockdown versus a certain level of virus circulation is going to differ according to the political preferences in a country or between countries or within a country over time. So there's a lot of things that go into an expectation for lockdown stringency, but just like we've now had to incorporate projections for vaccine rollout in that stage process that Jeremy's explained, we also are trying to incorporate projections for lockdown stringency, building it up from those subcomponents and changing it over time as, say, a government announces its plans for lockdown stringency over time. So that's sort of stage 2. And then stage 3 is, how does all that then become an economic forecast? And just like going from stage 1 to 2, 2 to 3 involves a lot of other additional considerations as well. Things like the broader macroeconomic policy environment, the global trade environment, all the things that we normally try and take into account in activity forecasts. But clearly it also involves the translation of lockdown stringency into activity. Now that's probably, well, it is not a straightforward relationship. It's not stationary over time. A given level of restrictions might translate into different levels of economic activity over time if, say, firms become better at operating, as they seem to have done, within a certain level of restrictions. Also, a given level of de jure restrictions can translate differently into mobility and economic activity as obedience of those changes, to those restrictions changes over time. So all this is just to say, it's a very difficult process. Forecasting has become even more difficult during the pandemic. Our sort of confidence intervals on our numbers must have increased as a result of that. But being sort of accountable and transparent of how we follow this stage process is, I think, the key thing for us.
I think that's a super useful, and I think important ground to cover in terms of what it actually looks like when economists are giving you forecasts, or at least when we're giving forecasts, in this kind of period. What is actually happening behind the scenes, just looking behind the curtain a bit, I think is hopefully helpful for listeners. Now, maybe let's get into the nuts and bolts of what we're actually expecting. So we did have an episode on vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism a few weeks back. That is still very relevant. And we talked a lot at the time, particularly about European challenges. So maybe if we keep things a little bit more high level or a little bit more focused on the differences across regions, I wanted to ask both about developed markets and then also emerging markets, because it seems as though there are very different pictures coming through. But Paul, maybe let's start off with the developed market side of things. And Jeremy, I'll bring you in on this again afterwards. But just what are you seeing in terms of for 2021? Are you hopeful? Are you encouraged? Or are you concerned around the outlook for vaccine rollout and ultimate inoculation in developed markets writ large in 2021?
Yeah. Well, if we take the stages along the way to a vaccine view that Jeremy outlined, so development of vaccines themselves done, sort of 100% probability at this point, but manufacture and delivery, rollout, so ability to administer them to the population, take up amongst the population, and the efficacy of the vaccines given. If you think about those stages, they sort of playing out in varied and interesting ways amongst the DMs. So basically all the major DMs are pretty well positioned in terms of manufacture out. Well, sorry, I should caveat this. In terms of pre-orders of vaccines, they're all pretty well positioned. So the US, the UK, Europe have all pre-ordered in excess of their populations. The number of doses, per capita doses, is greater than the populations. Actually taking delivery of what they pre-ordered has played out already quite differently amongst the DMs. And we did a whole episode on why Europe has fallen behind in that process, why its later speed at placing its pre-orders had slowed down taking delivery of vaccines. So for the US and UK, they look pretty good in terms of their delivery. I mean, there are some reasons to think that the supply slows a little bit from here. Europe is clearly the concern, and especially in the early stages in terms of taking delivery of vaccines. Then in terms of actually rolling them out to their population, so administering them in large-scale vaccine settings and in GP surgeries and everything in the middle, your starting point is probably that DMs can do this better than most EMs, just from a sort of relative wealth perspective. But smaller, denser, more concentrated countries are probably better at doing it than larger, more diverse, more dispersed, less dense countries, or indeed federations and large groupings like the EU, where there's going to be very different healthcare systems, different levels of sort of digital medical record keeping. So I think, again, Europe's going to have a bit of challenge on that front in particular. The US as well a bit. The UK clearly so far has done very well in terms of actually getting them into the arms of its population. Then if you think about take-up, the trends in the take-up surveys, as Jeremy has highlighted, are generally in the right direction, but absolute take-up willingness, again, especially in European countries, especially in France, are worryingly low and potentially fall below, if they don't keep rising, fall below the level that would guarantee herd immunity, which seems to be around 2/3 of the population requiring immunity. And then the final one is efficacy. And here, the mix of vaccines that the country has pre-ordered and taken delivery of seems to be what matters most of all. The US is rolling out the highly effective mRNA versions of the vaccine, where efficacy is in the high 90s. By contrast, the UK is rolling out primarily the AstraZeneca vaccine, where the efficacy is lower. Now, efficacy could change over time. Say variants could lower it. Dosing regimens seem to affect efficacy as well, but on the face of it, it looks like the UK is actually the worst place in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine mix it's going to deliver.
Great. I think it's really interesting that you say about the kind of different factors that might drive the effectiveness of a vaccine rollout, because I was just talking to a friend of mine back in Ireland yesterday, and I was saying, Ireland's been relatively slow off the mark. Part of that is a result of the European rollout. But she was saying one of the challenges is, yes, it's a small country with a small population, but they don't have a centralized, digitalized health system. And so their ability to get to people is one of the big challenges. And it's really a hard thing to overcome in the midst of a pandemic. Jeremy, can I bring you in here and get your take, particularly on what Paul's just said on developed markets, but also then evolving on to emerging markets?
Yeah, I think just from a high level perspective, I think one of the things that is clear in our latest projections is that the headline number for estimated effective inoculations by the end of 2021 hasn't changed much since we last did the exercise, in around November, right? So it's still around the 1.4 billion mark. But what did change was effectively the relative reach across the advanced economies and emerging economies. We've actually lifted the estimated numbers up in a number of advanced economies, and we've had to push them down in emerging economies. And so why is that? Well, part of it actually relates to the way that advanced economy purchase programs, those pre-ordering programs that Paul referred to, effectively crowding poorer countries out. I'm sure this is something that you broached on the on the diplomacy podcast. But if we think about it from a justice standpoint, right, it's understandable, but also a little bit unsavory just how little resources have been going into the COVAX project, for example, right? Now, you might argue that in a typical emerging market with a much more favorable age distribution, and therefore you may have an expectation that hospitalizations and fatalities associated with the virus might be lower. So from that perspective, maybe that's understandable. But from another perspective, particularly in the way that going forward in countries where vaccine penetration is relatively low, the potential for them to be squeezed out of parts of the international system, i.e. you can travel from this country, but you can't travel from that country. Well, can't travel from that country because we didn't make vaccines available, right? And this wouldn't be the first time in history we've been plagued by similar issues. So that sense in which you prioritize your own population rather than the global population, in this case, it's a concern. It's also the case that we have to be careful that we don't talk about emerging economies and developing countries as though they're monolithic. There are some radically different outcomes transpiring in different parts of the emerging market complex. I think we know, for example, that South and Central America have really struggled so far. But even within that, we're seeing Chile make very good advances on, on vaccine rollout and those plans, in part because of the coherence of the Chilean state compared to some other South American countries. Equally, Israel is in the bucket of emerging economies, certainly within an emerging market sort of bond index, and has been arguably the most successful country to date in progressing sort of vaccine rollout. Russia and China are countries that have been able to generate their own vaccines. And although in China's case, that vaccination program is going to proceed more slowly than elsewhere because the virus itself is circulating at such low levels, the constraints on activity are likely to be relatively minimal. The countries that you sort of become more concerned about, I think, are those where you lack that healthcare infrastructure, right? So if we're talking about digitalization challenges in Ireland, well, one can only imagine the scale of those in sub-Saharan Africa, right, or Guatemala, or countries like that. So that's one issue. Second, in a lot of poorer countries, urbanization rates are incredibly low still, right? So much lower than they are in the advanced economies, and sort of distributing vaccines in highly dispersed populations that are very remote. In some cases, they're difficult to reach. Certainly with some of the mRNA vaccines, that presents a particular challenge. And so again, we have this realization that in our projections, we have to take into account that slower rollout and maybe taking many years before you reach herd immunity in those countries. We have to take into account that might actually create the conditions for vaccine escape, actually, which then blows back onto the advanced economies in some way. But then I'm also conscious that when we do our global growth forecast, you do a market forecast, they're effectively weighted by the relative importance of a country's GDP or market, right? But the distribution of the world's population is quite different than the distribution of the world's GDP. And so again, we tend to talk less about what is a massive problem just because it doesn't move markets in the same way as when we're talking about China, the United States, and the EU, but it is something that we have clearly articulated views on.
Yeah, I think that point really hasn't been made very much. I have to say this is one of the first times I've heard it be made, that the kind of the GDP weighting that maybe naturally people involved in financial markets place on this kind of outlook can maybe skew the realities for people on the ground in terms of what they're actually going to experience. And I'm interested actually to pull in a little bit of what you said around China. China's an interesting case study where they are producing a vaccine. It's kind of unclear about how efficacious it is. Manufacturing seems quite low, but their demand is also relatively low because they're able to constrain the virus. And I think that brings us nicely to the next section, which is about the stringency. So how do you translate a vaccine view into a view on reopening? So maybe, Paul, to bring you back in around the overall outlook for stringency changes or reopening in the coming months. What are you kind of expecting by way of reopening? What do you expect to go first? And then what do you expect to kind of take a little bit longer?
Yeah, so I think you can think about it in a number of ways. One would be, what is the general speed of reopening? And our broad expectation is it is slower than it was last summer, where there's now a general consensus the reopening then was overly rapid. It is perhaps a year-long process to remove and deconstruct the majority of restrictions. And that probably applies in most economies, but clearly some will have more desire to ease more rapidly than others who will take a more cautious approach. There's then the ordering at which restrictions are lifted, and we think that ordering goes something like what has already been announced in the UK, which is schools open first, then you try and open outdoor hospitality, then you try and open other forms of non-essential retail, then you allow increasingly large gatherings and a bit more in the way of internal movement. And only later on, if ever, do you allow an increased amount of international travel. So, and I think that ordering is generally thought of as the right kind of ordering. It's something like allow the most economically damaging restrictions to lift first. And then there's what remains in the long term. So say the reopening is by and large a 2021 process, but what remains at the end of 2021 and into the long term? And our thought is something like it's international travel restrictions or some form thereof that largely remain, perhaps also forms of mask mandates. There's an interesting question about whether countries follow the regional versus national approach in this reopening. Clearly in the summer reopening and then the autumn winter lockdown 2.0, there was a lot of regional approaches taken that were to do with the levels of circulating virus. I think that by and large, the view, at least in Europe, is that those regional approaches were unsuccessful. And it's not the preference to go down that route this time around. Certainly the UK's announcements recently don't point to that. But on the other hand, very large, physically large countries with very different rates of virus incidence, even after vaccine rollout, say the US, it's a continental setting, and its politics is obviously quite dispersed as well, perhaps do continue to follow that regional route. And then perhaps the final thing to consider is, does lockdown easing pause or reverse at any point? And one obviously hopes not, but clearly there are scenarios of plausible vaccine escape scenarios, mutation scenarios in which there may well be a desire to at least ease the pace of easing. One could imagine next winter, say, there could be a little bit of that going on. But by and large, the direction of travel seems to be clear and the ordering seems to be fairly clear as well.
Could I just chip in on that? I mean, because I think actually that point you already alluded to what is a little bit different in the United States, which is obviously its federal structure that actually means that much of this is actually determined at the state and local level rather than the federal level. Australia is another example where individual states impose restrictions at the border with very little input from the federal government, and that approach seems likely to continue. But also the US is interesting in terms of the ordering being somewhat different, because I think we're all aware that effectively the average level of restrictions in the US through the winter surge was less onerous than it has been in the UK and large parts of Europe, not because the virus was less dangerous. So they've just ticked over 500,000 people, sort of passed away as sort of COVID related or sort of within a certain time period of having contracted COVID. But it's fascinating to me is this school versus hospitality trade-off in the United States. So in large parts of the US, schools never went back, right? So actually you're facing a third consecutive, semester, as we might call it, or term, right? Where, some children have not had a full day of in-school learning in nearly 12 months, whilst in those same localities, hospitality is much more open. So the range of restrictions around what you can do and where you can visit is lower, or where, for example, you can attend sort of sporting events, albeit in lower numbers. And so that is also fascinating to me, is the way that different countries have approached the trade-offs differently, which are partly institutional, because again, it's not just governments. When you decentralize, for example, education, then representatives of teachers can have different views about what is safe and what is not safe, and then that influences sort of opening in a way, or for that segment in a way that's different from hospitality. And so I think, again, we're talking about layers of complication in a set of forecasts. We have to build up this fine political economy, cultural economy view, in a sense, to try and anticipate what that sort of future pathway looks like.
And maybe actually just on from that, you mentioned schools versus hospitality. From an economic impact perspective, when you start feeding a view of stringency into the forecast, what are the things that have the biggest benefit from an economic growth perspective? Is it kids being back at school because parents are more able to work, or is it actually hospitality being open? I mean, what are the biggest bang for your buck in terms of reopening and impact on growth? Maybe, I don't know, Paul, if you want to hit it first, and then Jeremy.
They're all important, but clearly there's a way in which hospitality can still operate through COVID secure ways in terms of takeaways and outdoor dining. By contrast, it's much harder for the quality of education to be the same in a setting where it's all online. I speak from personal experience here, bitter personal experience, and the impact it has on parents as well. So I have not seen sort of robust empirical studies on this, but I imagine that you do get more bang for your buck in terms of near-term activity. But then, of course, there's a crucial consideration about its long-term effects in terms of human capital destruction from missing, as Jeremy says, up to a year of in-person, in-classroom schooling. So it's not just what does this do to GDP next year, but it's how does this impact our economic growth, the long-term damage from the crisis over the very long term. It's easier, albeit still very difficult, but easier to provide liquidity bridges to hospitality firms that are shut down than it is to, you can't loan out a child a year of education.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. You could plausibly argue that the things that will get you fastest back to, say, the pre-COVID trend pathway for activity are likely to be the things that are currently operating way below that previous capacity, which is going to be a lot of service sector activity, right? So if you, for example, if you released all restrictions today, right. Then there's going to be a lot more people suddenly in pubs and restaurants and enjoying themselves, international, all that sort of stuff, and you'll get a tremendous growth through that pathway. But if we think about it from a long-term perspective, the things that drive potential growth, again, this is not to diminish the economic role the hospitality sector plays, or the fact that, or the hardship that a lot of sort of especially small proprietors have been going through, and the way that if you have too many bankruptcies, that can damage potential output itself. But it is incredibly difficult to replace that lost year of quality schooling, which in some cases is extreme because you might not have proper access to the internet. You may only have one device to share amongst 3 or 4 people in a household or more, right? You might be competing for airtime with 35 other people on a Zoom call, right? You might have even difficulty getting your child to sit down. You know, the challenges are enormous. And so what I have seen is, for example, the World Bank in its long-term projections does take into account the human capital destruction that is associated with the COVID crisis. And, you know, you're talking about billions of hours of schooling cumulatively lost through this pandemic. And unless you're of the belief, you know, of the view that education is just a signaling device, which I'm not, then that will have effects that last not 1 year, not 5 years, but they'll carry on for decades.
So I think this is all really kind of captured just how complex an environment this is for forecasting. And I'm going to be really mean here and ask you to give me just one sentence, if you could summarize how you're viewing the economic outlook against the backdrop of all of what we've talked about. How would you categorize it? Paul?
Well, let me just do the short term then. The vaccine projections we've talked about, the stringency easing process we've talked about, means for the next 2 years, above trend global growth, and at the headline level at least, some pretty strong and punchy global growth numbers. But that's just the near term.
And then Jeremy, in the long term?
Okay, my takeaway is that the strength of that cyclical recovery is going to, in the near term, mask the extent of the long-term damage that this crisis is doing, that it is still reasonable to expect a fairly substantial hit to long-term potential growth that will vary significantly across countries. And that is part of our responsibility to be focused on that angle as well, because it will have important consequences, not just for economies and welfare, but for markets. But you'll hear more from us on that front in future episodes and research, I would hope.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But a huge thanks to Paul and Jeremy for your insights, for your candor on the challenges that economists are facing in terms of forecasting growth now and going forward. And the biggest thanks goes to our audience. We've been really blown away by the amount of interest and support in this podcast, and we're really keen to keep that momentum going. So if you do have any comments on this discussion today, questions or ideas for future episodes, you can email us at macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com. Otherwise, please join us again next week when we'll be talking about our research into the economics of gender equality and how policies can boost female participation and ultimately long-term growth.
Please note that email is not a secure form of communication, so don't send any personal or sensitive information. This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.